Our first speaker in this webinar series, our speaker of today is Alasdair Young. And Alasdair, I'm very happy to have you here. I feel honored that you accepted my invitation to start this webinar series in this kick-off event. For those who do not know Alasdair Young, he is professor at Georgia Tech at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. And he serves as director of the Center for International Strategy, Technology and Policy and co-director of the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies. Okay, then without further ado, I think, Alasdair, you could start your presentation and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Joachim, for the introduction. I have to say that I'm honored to and quite intimidated to be the first speaker in this series. Can you see my slides? Okay, great. I have to admit that when I was agreeing the date for this talk, I was focused on my work schedule and I wasn't paying attention to what was going on just before. So on one hand, it seems kind of strange not to be talking about the presidential election, as that's been sort of all-consuming for the past several months. On the other hand, it is a blessed relief from the depressing and distressing outcome. So I will hope you will indulge me in my mental escapism to talk about my research. So the paper I'm presenting today is based on a paper that I co-authored with Scott Brown at the University of Dundee. It began as a paper for a project on transatlantic cooperation organized by TUM, EUI, and Princeton. And for that, they were asking for some case studies on US-China geopolitical competition involving technology. And so we struck upon semiconductors. What I'm presenting here is a reworked version of that paper, which I presented at the ECPR Standing Group on the EU's conference in Lisbon this past summer. And that paper, we shifted the focus to consider what these cases reveal about the EU's capacity in a more geopolitical world. Now, say we have not grappled with the implications of our case study selection. The cases came first in the sort of the wider new perspective came second. So the two cases that we consider, one is the concern that Chinese 5G equipment and telecommunications infrastructure could compromise national security by giving China access to secrets or control over critical infrastructure. This is, we consider, economic security. The second is efforts to curb China's access to cutting-edge semiconductors to impede its ability to develop hyper-advanced weapons. This is a geopolitical concern related to the balance of power. I should add that the empirical research, especially on export controls, is at a very preliminary stage. The work on 5G is more advanced, but is complicated by the lack of good publicly available data on the extent to which Huawei, in particular, 5G equipment is actually in European networks, and to officials' reluctance to discuss sensitive material. Because being an associate dean has been more all-consuming than I had anticipated, I have not made as much progress on advancing this paper as I had hoped when I agreed to give this talk. What progress I have made has been thanks to my graduate research assistants, Emily Stepanovich and Anna A.K. Hambrick. And I should also note that in the meantime, Scott has had a very interesting article comparing US and EU responses to Huawei and TikTok, which is in the latest issue of the Journal of European Integration, which I recommend you check out. So I've now, with that, I conclude my throat clearing, as the Brits would call it, and I can turn to the substance of the paper. So both with respect to 5G and export controls, authority lies primarily with the member states, which make them hard cases for the EU to play a geopolitical role. With respect to 5G, however, there's been a degree of a coordinated response in Europe. The Commission created a 5G toolbox, which provides guidance on how member states should take decisions about high-risk suppliers of telecommunications equipment. Some member states have taken steps to restrict Huawei's presence in their networks. Others have not. With respect to export controls, the Commission's plans to increase the EU's capacity to develop common export controls independently from multilateral regimes, autonomous export controls, has been kicked into touch, at least temporarily. So to us, it seems as though the burgeoning literature on geoeconomics elides two distinct types of policy. And we're not multiple distinct types of policy. But we're not alone in this. Sophie Meunier and Sarah Bareilles-Dansman and Anna Hans-Sorales, at least, have also begun to grapple with this. And this is the piece that bit that I have managed to develop since the paper this summer. Scott bears no responsibility for this, so I blame it entirely on me. But I think it is useful to distinguish between policies on two dimensions. There are those policies that have security as their primary objective, whether it's reducing vulnerability to coercion or influencing the balance of power, and then range of other policy objectives. And then whether the EU is seeking to protect itself, what I would call term economic security, or is trying to use economic tools to influence others or the balance of power, what I classify as economic statecraft. And our contention is that these policies have very different political processes. They involve different actors. They have different cost and benefit calculations because the objectives are so different. And it is important to not treat them all as the same. So our case studies fall into the area of security, but they differ with respect to being offensive, export controls, or defensive 5G. I should say the policies in brackets are ones where there have been proposals floated, but there have not actually been any policies adopted. So in line with others in the geoeconomics literature, we stress the role of agents in making the case that changes in the international context require specific policy responses. We do so by drawing on securitization theory, which as far as we know has not been applied to EU trade policy, although you kind of seen in the context of the EU's quest for digital sovereignty. Securitization theory draws attention to the importance of the audience in accepting the securitizing move. Our use of securitization theory is different from the traditional use, as the securitizing move is usually about decision makers seeking to persuade their publics or legislatures that extraordinary measures are warranted. In our case, the agents are seeking to persuade other decision makers, member state governments, to act. We also draw a distinction between agents seeking to persuade audiences to take defensive economic measures and persuade audiences to take steps to use economic instruments for geopolitical ends. We draw a distinction between straight up securitization and what we're at least temporarily calling geopoliticization. In our cases, both the Commission and the US government are agents seeking to persuade member states to act. What we're trying to do is explain two dimensions of variation among member states with respect to restricting Huawei, and why the EU has been more successful with respect to Huawei than it has been on export control. Particularly as the EU already has an export control regime, but did not have a framework for addressing technologies of concern, one might actually expect it to be easier for the EU to develop autonomous capacity and export controls than to act to restrict Huawei. We argue that the variance amongst the member states' responses on Huawei is due to differences in the extent to which they perceive China as a threat. We contend that the lack of action on export controls is due to the member states, while they might see China as a threat, do not see it as a geostrategic rival. It's just a different way of viewing China, which in part is a reflection of how the EU views itself. So turning to the Huawei case. So in 2015, the EU-China high-level economic and trade dialogue welcomed strategic cooperation with China on 5G. But only a few years later, the importance of 5G equipment in critical information infrastructure and the dominance of Huawei in supplying it led to concerns that Huawei, at the behest of the Chinese government, could facilitate espionage, enable cyber attacks, or even shut down communications and other networks. The 2020 Toolbox for 5G Security offered the member states a path to establish new security standards for equipment suppliers that they would have to meet in order to be authorized to participate in 5G infrastructure. This toolbox was endorsed by the Council, but it lacks enforcement measures, and it's left to the individual member states to adopt measures. Now, the extent to which the member states have done so reflects the extent to which they see China as a threat. The horizontal axis reflects attitudes towards de-risking their economic relationships, which we are using as a proxy for their perception of China as a risk. This is taken from March and Wessing's report for the European think tank network on China in July 2023. The vertical axis indicates access that has been taken against Huawei. Now, this is based by John Scott's research using publicly available documents. At the top is requiring the Huawei equipment be removed from networks. My understanding is in July, Germany has just announced a two-stage rip and replace process with Chinese 5G technology needing to be removed or replaced in core facilities by 2026 and completely by 2029. Below that is simply excluding high-risk vendors from the network to start with. And at the bottom are not putting any restrictions at all. And the general perception of the threat posed by China seems to be a pretty good predictor of action on Huawei, with the member states clustering either in the upper right or lower left corners. That's particularly the case if one considers that press reports indicate that the Netherlands has also restricted Huawei, but has done so secretly rather than publicly. So that's why it's getting lower down. And a number of member states, Ireland, Portugal, and Italy, that don't generally have high, are not particularly concerned about China, took steps to restrict 5G in the wake of Russia's further invasion of Ukraine, but not until that point. So that was sort of when security was seen as a greater concern. Right? So that's, at least as a first cut, it would seem as though the perception of threats from China is goes quite a long way to explaining member states' actions to restrict or to accept the Commission's securitizing move to limit Huawei's access to the network. But turning to export controls, I'm particularly wary about discussing them in front of Joachim, but he invited me, so here goes. I'm going to start with a quick clarification, which confused me at first, and I'm going to assume at least some of you are as ignorant as I was. The export controls actually entails two decisions, and these are often sort of jumbled up in the press, which is why it's important to distinguish them. So one is whether a particular dual-use good should be controlled, that is, require an export license, and the second is whether an export license should be granted in a specific instance for a controlled product for a sale to a particular consumer. Now, export controls in the EU are weird. They're about controlling trade, which is an exclusive EU competence, and the single market makes it really, creates a really strong incentive for a common regime to prevent goods just simply being exported through another member state. but they are about achieving international security objectives, keeping weapons or dual-use goods, those items that can be or used as or used to make weapons, out of the hands of bad actors, which is a member state prerogative. The EU has sought to square that circle between the incentives for a common action and the member states' desire to keep control of security by basing its list of controlled products largely on those agreed by the member states in a variety of international regimes that govern export controls. The EU's export control regulation has a mechanism for basically downloading those items that are controlled, that are agreed multilaterally, into EU law. Right? So the EU thus does not have an autonomous ability to designate products as subject to export controls, with the exception of cybersecurity goods, which was adopted as part of a reform in 2021. Member states, however, can designate items as requiring export licenses. The member states also decide whether or not to approve a particular export. Thus, the EU notionally has a common policy, but it doesn't decide its content or implement it. Now, under both the Trump and Biden administrations, the US has imposed controls on the export of advanced semiconductors and the machines to make them to China, and has pressed its allies to join them. The EU is not able to, although the Netherlands has, to an extent. In June 2023, the European Economic Security Strategy identified a pressing need to strengthen the EU's autonomous ability to adopt export controls. It identified three particular motivations. One was the Western response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, highlighted the need for faster and more uniform EU export controls. Because of the weirdness of the EU's export control regime, all of the EU's export controls on Russia have been adopted as sanctions, not as export controls. All right, so they've been adopted in the context of the common foreign and security policy rather than as trade policy. The second reason for increasing the EU's autonomous capacity is the decision-making in the multilateral export control regimes that are the source of the EU's controlled items has been paralyzed by Russia. The third is that some member states, notably the Netherlands, have adopted unilateral controls on the export of emerging technologies. In making the case for urgency, the Economic Security Strategy argued that in some cases, technology leakage risks strengthening the military intelligence capabilities of those that could use them to undermine peace and security. Right? A very geopolitical vision. In January, rather than advancing proposals for concrete action, the Commission issued only a white paper, which does not represent the prompt action the Economic Security Strategy said was necessary, and push its efforts to develop the EU's autonomous capacity to export controls to an evaluation or a review of the 2021 the dual-use regulation. Press reports indicate that the Commission pulled back from advancing a more ambitious proposal in the face of member state opposition. Some of that opposition had to do with member states not wanting to cede authority in this area, but press reports also indicate that member states did not see China in the same kind of security threat as in the context of geostrategic competition, right? And we'll see a very different understanding of China's relationship with the EU compared to the US. Right? Thus, the EU does not have the ability to align its export controls with the US. Now, the Commission has not given up. Commission President von der Leyen, in her political guidelines for the next Commission, calls for building a genuine coordinated approach to export controls. So watch this space. But at least the Commission's initial efforts clearly failed quite substantially. So what do we draw from these cases? One is that the Commission and the US have sought to securitize semiconductors in the context of both 5G and export controls. The EU was able to agree a framework on 5G, even if it was up to the member states whether or not to implement it. Efforts to enhance the EU's capacity to adopt autonomous export controls fell at the first attempt. Member state action on Huawei seems to fit well with their perceptions of the security risk from China. On export controls, member states' reluctance to suit authority in a security area muddies the picture a bit, but not seeing China as a strategic rival seems to at least in part be part of the explanation. So this suggests there's sort of limits to the EU's capacity as a geoeconomic player due to different member states' differing perceptions of the threats, in this case from China, and from what might describe sort of as a strategic sense of self. That I would welcome your thoughts and comments. Thank you.